Okay, welcome to part 3 of the video series on rigging this character. This is the last one. This one is going to be considerably shorter than the others, but nevertheless, I always recommend that you watch tutorials at 2 times speed and check the description for my timestamps. And in this video, we are going to go over binding the skin, although we're not covering it in great detail because it's just a rigid character and we're just using a simple method. And then we're going to cover locking out the controls just to finalize it and have it ready for the animator. All right, so the final stage in the rigging process for this character is to actually attach the mesh to the rig, otherwise the character's not going to move. Now, before I do that, I need to actually go grab the latest version of the model, because as I've said, I've been working with a temporary version of the model, and this one doesn't include UVs and has a few little issues here and there that needed to be taken care of. But those are done now, so I can actually grab the latest ones from the modeler. Now at the very beginning of this tutorial, I showed you how to set up the Maya project, and that will include the scenes folder with all of your Maya files in it. And at this point, that structure is going to help us because Maya will automatically look in that scenes folder when we need to go grab the latest mesh. If you've been hopping around between different computers or different projects, you need to first make sure that you go up to File, Set Project. Remember, before we used Project Window to make a new one, but now we need Set Project. And we need to go find that project folder. You can either click on it once to highlight it blue here, or you can double click to enter it. Just once you've entered it, don't click on any of these because that will highlight one of those instead of the actual project folder. Once you're in this directory here and you see your workspace.mel, again, don't click on any of these, but you're ready to click set. And now the project is set, and Maya will continue to look in that folder directory for all of your textures and modeling needs. Now, I've already gone ahead and placed the latest model into that scenes folder that I received from my modeler. So I can just go to File, Import, and it automatically looks in that scene folder. Now you'll notice that I have a lot more in here than you saw when I started this project, and that's because I've been saving all along, all these additional versions over here. And the new model that I want is right here. This guy right here, version 60. We've gone up 15 versions since before. Isn't that crazy? Okay, and we'll go ahead and hit import. And there it is. All of the content from that scene has been dumped into this scene. And we ended up with a couple of extra cameras that I don't need, so I'm just going to click on each of those and delete them. But what we're left behind with is this mesh that has the UVs and everything else ready to go. Now when you import, it comes with the name of the file underscore the name of the object, and I don't need that anymore, so I'm just going to come back here and rename this to BilliardBot underscore mesh. Then I'm going to open up my groups over here and get rid of the old mesh, which I've conveniently named old mesh so I can remember where it is. Just delete that, and I'm going to move BilliardBot underscore mesh, middle mouse drag it into that folder there, and then I'm going to add it to the mesh layer over here by right-clicking, Add Selected Objects. Now, if you've taken data from a different Maya project, it's a good idea to check your namespaces. So I'm going to go up to Windows, General Editors, Namespace Editor, and in this case, I don't have anything extra, but depending on your import settings or if you copy pasted objects into this scene or however, you might have extra namespaces in here. Namespaces can be useful for importing multiple copies of a character into a scene, but you don't want that at this stage because you'll end up with this compounding amount of namespaces and all kinds of crazy shenanigans going on in here. So if you have anything extra in here, often you'll see like a pasted namespace, something like that. You can select those and hit delete, and it'll ask you to merge them back into the root, and that's going to be just fine. In this case, I don't have anything extra in here, so we're going to close this window, and we're good to go. All right, so it's time to bind the character. So firstly, let's get the joints that we need to make this bind. We're going to start from the root, and I'm going to hold right-click and say Select Hierarchy. And if I hit F in the outliner, it'll show everything that I've got selected. And I'm just going to come through here and deselect all of the joints and other items that I don't want to be part of the bind. So holding Control, I'm going to deselect all the ones that say null, as well as these constraints. Get rid of the nulls, constraint, get rid of these effectors, get rid of this constraint, the null, that null too, don't forget. Okay, and this is why we named them null, so that it's very obvious which ones should not be part of this bind. And we'll just kind of casually scroll through back here. Make sure that we've got the things we want and don't have the things we don't want. And I think that's going to be it. Next, we need to add the mesh to our selection. So we'll shift click on the mesh. And at this point, we need to make sure that we don't have any additional history or other garbage happening on the mesh. We can see here that the inputs don't contain a bunch of tweaks or other things like that, and that's a good place to be, because after the bind, you really aren't going to be able to delete history anymore. In fact, pretty much everything past this stage of the rigging process, you really shouldn't be going back to deleting history, because it relies on that history for a lot of the rig to actually be connected and work. So this is kind of your last chance to do that on the mesh. All right, then we're going to go up to our rigging menu set, go up to skin, bind skin with options. Now there used to be a rigid bind skin set of options in here that still exists in Maya, but they pulled it out of the menus, presumably because a lot of its functionality can be achieved through this window. So if you're interested in that, you can check out the Maya knowledge base to find some more of that. Now we're going to look through some of the options that we have here. So we have, of course, bind to, joint hierarchy, selected joints, object hierarchy. And we're just going to do selected joints. That's why we just went through and selected those. And that's going to make sure that we don't have any of the nulls or anything else included in there. Then we're going to have the bind method. This is a couple of options that let you get a good start for your bind. If you're working on an organic character, I highly recommend using geodesic voxel. This is a much newer algorithm, and it takes into account the volume of the character and actually does its best to, whether they're contiguous pieces or not, bind the appropriate pieces to the appropriate joints. And I've had a lot of success with this one. The other methods are a little bit older and less accurate for what we're going to need. I'm just going to choose closest distance because geodesic voxel takes a little longer to process, and I actually don't need what it's going to achieve for me. So I'm just going to go with this cheaper one here, closest distance. And we're going to go over a little bit of cleanup of the weight painting to make it do exactly what we want. Now for this character, it's going to be very easy to override whatever this gives us because it's a rigid kind of character. We don't need a lot of the soft transitions, and it's going to be very easy to just go through and flood a lot of those sections. And I'll show you how to do that a little bit later. Then this one, skinning method. This is really important. The issue with binding a mesh is that we are taking the visual approximation of our character, which is made of polygons, and we are binding it to joints. But what's inside is just empty. There's no muscle tissue, there's no bones, there's nothing like that going on inside of the character. And so the classic linear bind will actually not preserve volume the way a real life character would. And there's lots of fancy solutions for that, but unfortunately we don't really get to use them, like dual quaternion. This one does pretty good things around elbows and knees to kind of preserve that volume, but to my knowledge this does not export to any modern game engines. So we're going to have to stick with classic linear. And while it might be slightly problematic in terms of losing volume, it's usually not that noticeable, and especially for a rigid character like this, it's not going to be a problem. Then normalize weights. This is something that you really need to take into account. Normalization is just when all of the things equal 1. If you end up painting weights on a character and it's one part starts off at 50%, the other one starts off at 50%, and then you add some to it, then you might have 115% by the time you're done. That is not a normalized amount of weight painting. So an interactive form here will let you constantly change the weights, but dynamically keep clamping things back down so that they always equal 100%. No less, no more. And that's really important before you export your characters, because a character that doesn't have all of the joints adding up to at least 100% will end up leaving any of those vertices behind. Even if you have 90% and 9%, that last 1% is enough for it to be thrown off, and it doesn't know how to move those vertices. So normalization is key, and we want to keep this mode on interactive so that Maya is handling that for us. In some advanced workflows, you'll want to turn this off, but you can always switch back and forth during the weight painting process. For now, we're going to leave it on interactive though. And then weight distribution also has to do with the interactive weight painting. So that's going to be fine at distance. Allow multiple bind poses is something for much more advanced kinds of rigs, so that's not going to be an issue. Max number of influences. For you, this is probably set to 3, and that's going to be great for organic kinds of characters because we need multiple joints influencing any particular vertex. But for this character, I actually just want 1 because he's a completely rigid character. Now, maintain max influences, you usually want this off because depending on the character, in fact, honestly, in my experience, every character, you might have a particular piece that only needs 1 or 2 joints, and then some that need 3 or 4, and that is going to vary all the time. So I like to leave this off so we have that option later. Remove unused influences, that should be fine. Colorize skeleton, this is up to you. If it does it properly, the joints will then get some rainbowy colors, and it doesn't make a difference for the end game, it just makes it a little nicer to look at while you're working on it in here. And then the drop-off rate has to do with the way that it blends those influences together. So again, it's not going to be that big of a deal for us on this particular character. Alright, with all of those set, the most important one being skinning method classic linear, just so it goes out to game properly, and bind to selected joints, we are going to hit bind skin. And this will add some history to our object here. We see skin cluster 1, and this has all of those settings and such on here. And if we go up to the skin, paint skin weights with options, that will bring up this window here. And this is where we can see the actual bind as it has attached to our character. And what you can see is a range of influence from black to white, black being no influence, white being 100% influence. And we can see that for whichever joint we select up here in this hierarchy. So if I just start clicking through here, we can see that each of these pieces is being influenced by these particular joints. Now we're going to come through and override pretty much every one of these because they're not actually cleaned for a rigid kind of character. And that was expected with the binding method that we used. And for this character, it's actually going to be one of the easiest painting jobs that you can do. But before that, you should see a little bit of what's going wrong with this character. So I'm just going to get out of my weight paint tool by going to my selection tool here. And I'll play around with the rig itself so you can see what's going wrong. If we pull this up and down, we can see that the character is kind of mashing into itself as we go through here. Right? If we rotate this around, all kinds of things are exploding and going wrong. If we grab the antenna here and I pull this down, horrible things are happening to the head. So this is bound to happen when you first bind a character, and that's why we're going to fix it. So clicking back on the mesh, going back to this tool, we get this hierarchy open again, and we're just going to go to the root. Now this is a pretty widely used method. We don't really care about the binding method that was used initially. We're just going to flood all of the weight onto the root and then slowly take away from it. With the interactive binding normalization method here, you really never want to subtract weights from the mesh. And that's because it's going to force it to always equal a total influence of 1. So if I subtract something from a vertex, it's got to show up somewhere else by nature of using the interactive normalization, which sometimes is nice, but usually you don't have a choice of where those weights are going. So if you're subtracting them, it could be going elsewhere and ruining your weight painting for everywhere else. And that's really not ideal. So for some workflows, particularly for rigid characters, riggers like to start from the root, just flood everything to the root, and then slowly work their way back out. And that's what we're going to do. So instead of using any of the brushes or anything like that, let's go to the select mode over here. And this will let me come over here and click on the vertices that I want to flood to. So I'm just going to hit Control-Shift-A to highlight everything. And I could just click the flood button, but I also have this control right here, and I can just drag the opacity of the influence here to 1, so that we're doing it 100. Whatever we're about to do will happen 100%. And I'm going to increase this value to 1. And I'm getting a warning down here, and that's because I didn't actually pick a joint to influence to, so we'll click Root. Then we'll slide this slider up to 1. There we go. So that should have flooded everything with 100% because this value is not just setting the brush while we're in this mode, this select mode here, it's actually changing it as I change this slider. So as I scroll all the way up to there, we should have influenced this root, all of those vertices flooding it perfectly. And if I go back to this paint mode, we should see everything showing up perfectly white. And by nature of using the interactive normalization mode, now all of that weight should have been stolen away from all of the other joints. And if I try to click on some of these, we should get a fully black character as we go through this whole thing. Okay, and that seems to be the case as we go. Yep, looks good. All right. And what we'll see now, if we go back to our selection tool and we grab our root control, move this up and down, the whole character moves. Okay, so it's almost like not being bound anymore, but it is. We'll click back on the mesh, we'll click back to our paint tool here, and we'll go into select. Now we're just going to work our way down the hierarchy and start flooding things in. So I'm going to just click off once to deselect all of those components. I'm going to click antenna 1, so that we're painting influence to that. And we're in select mode here. I'm just going to zoom in and double click right there. Right there like that. And click antenna and increase the value to 1. Next up, we'll go to antenna. We will double click on the second part here. Go to antenna 2 and flood that up to 1. Click on the next antenna, click on the next chunk of the mesh, and slide that value up to 1. For antenna 3, slide that value up to 1. Then when we go back to paint, we should see that flooded white, stolen away from the root. And if we go back to our regular selection mode here, play with the antenna controller, we should see that everything is working as expected. Excellent. So I finished off that process for the rest of the joints, and it really was exactly the same thing, selecting the vertices, going to the value and sliding it up to 1, making sure that it was actually selected to the appropriate joints. And now we want to take a look at these controls and make sure they actually move the arms in the way that we were hoping that they would. And it looks like everything there worked out. I'm going to try selecting all of the finger rings here. Let me lock actually my joints layer and my mesh layer. And when I box select over each of these, we should be able to rotate and get exactly the behavior we're expecting. Cool, and at this point we can even hide the joints layer to be a little bit more representative of the final rig. And this is way easier to look at now that we can in fact hide these things down here. So the joints, that is. And if we grab this control, that's working. And if we grab the main body, that's working. We don't have any more of that weird stretching or exploding happening anymore. We can zero this out. Cool. We can grab the visor. And I might have missed the visor. Yep, I missed the visor on my job back there. So let me fix that really quick. So what happened here is I forgot to include the visor on the initial bind. So this will actually be a good lesson here, is I need to actually add that as an influence. So let's minimize each of these and just select the visor right there and shift select the mesh, and we'll go up to skin, edit influences, add influence. And let me open up the little options box here, make sure we're going to be just fine. Geometry, use geometry. I'm going to turn this off because we don't need to actually have it figure out the weights for us. Weight locking, lock weights. I'm going to turn that off as well. All of that just back down to, we'll try even like a 0 for the drop off there. And we're just trying to add it to the hierarchy. So when we hit add, now let's go back to the mesh, check out in this tool, and if we go to paint mode, we should be able to have a look around here at our joints, see what the influences are for that, and we should see basically none. Okay, that looks good. And then we just need to go one last time, the exact same process. We'll go to select, double click the visor, find our visor joint here, click on that guy, and slide the value up to 1. All right, now I think we are really done this time. So we'll go back to paint. We got 100% on white for that guy. We'll go back to our regular selection mode. Now when we rotate the visor, we're good to go. So let me now lock out the mesh, lock out the joints. Okay, looking good. We can do that thing. The modeler has fixed the issues in here, so when I pull this back, it looks like I forgot to hook up the translates for this guy here. So we will do that really quick now as well. Let me unhide the mesh joints. It's always good to check these things before we actually pass it on to the animator. So we've got the rotates hooked up. I'm just going to add a point constraint. So we'll grab the visor, then shift grab the joint and go to constrain, point, and now I should be able to move the visor back and forth. Good. And this has solved the issue that I had before, which is where as this moved back, we ended up getting this mouthpiece clipping through the whole face. So that's cleaner. We can reset this back to 0. All of that seems fine. I'm going to re-hide the joints. And this is getting pretty close to animation ready. The only thing now is to add some limitations to these transforms. So if I grab the antenna here, the most obvious one is that this pushes way too far, like that. So obviously we want to limit how high up and down it can go. Now this limit is going to be in local space, so let's change our pivoting point here by holding W and holding left click. And I can change this from world to object so that our manipulator shows the object axes. And in this case, X is my up and down, so I want to limit the X. And then we'll go over to the attribute editor and then come over to the transform node here, which is named after the object in the outliner. And then we'll come down to limit information, translate, and I want to translate limit X, turn that on, translate limit X on the maximum side, turn that on, and now we shouldn't be able to move it up and down more than those maximums and minimums. And I just want to change this minimum down a bit, so I'm going to uncheck the minimum, and Maya has this cool feature here where I can just kind of eyeball it and get it to that feels about right there. And then I can just come over here and click this button, which will dump this value into this side. So I'll just click on that. It dumps it over there. And now I can turn my limit back on. And now I can come up and down. And I need to change this maximum just to an actual 0 now. There we go. We go down to the minimum I wanted. And we can go up to the maximum that doesn't push it any higher than that right there. Excellent. Next, we want to start locking things in our channels. So I'm going to grab all of these controls. And since all of this stuff is locked, I should be able to just box select over this, except I can't because I've got a couple of these things down here that are not locked out either. So let's take care of those right now. And I'm going to just open up the feet, and it's these IKs right here. Remember, they are selectable objects. And I'm just going to hit H to hide them. And that's going to make it so that when I box select over these, they are not getting selected. And this should make it so that now, indeed, I can use my controls with no worries. So I'm going to box select over all of these. Then I'm going to go to the scales, and I'm going to click and drag over these, right click, and say lock and hide selected. And that's going to both lock the channels and hide them from our view. If I ever needed to bring those back, I could always go to Edit, Channel Control, and this will pop up a window here, and I can see my keyable section over here and my non-keyable hidden section. So if I scroll down, I should be able to find all of those scales, scale XYZ, and I would be able to bring those back into the keyable section right here. You'll also notice that there's a lot of other things that are hidden from you by default, because this would be kind of overwhelming if all of these were there. Anyway, I actually did want those hidden, so I'm just going to hit close. For all of those, I wanted to lock out the scales, but now I want to get a little bit more specific. So I'm going to grab the master mover here, and we are actually going to bring that back in this case. So once again, Edit, Channel Control, find my scale XYZ, and instead of moving them over to keyable, I'm going to move them over to non-keyable displayed. We'll move those there, and we'll grab each of these and move those over, move them over one more time, and now they're all displayed, but they are not keyable. And we'll close this, and actually I'll unlock my scales from here. And we will do right click, unlock selected. So now, because a master mover should not be receiving keyframes, I can pose this thing, but I shouldn't be able to actually set keys on those values. Next up is the arms. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm actually just going to box select over all of my arm controls right there. Hold Shift and Control to add those to my selection. Same thing for this side. And right there. Okay, excluding the clavicle, because that one's going to be a little bit different. And these ones should never translate. It's all rotations. It's FK based, so it's all rotations. So I'm going to grab my Translate XYZ, right click, lock and hide selected. So now those are away. Then my pole targets over here, these should never rotate or scale. So I'm going to grab all the rotates, right click, lock and hide selected. Then the visor. This one should only be translating not up and down, not left or right, but just along the Y. So I'm going to grab X and Z, right click, lock and hide selected. And then for rotate, it's actually not supposed to rotate along these axes, just that way, not like that either. So going to grab the X and Y rotates, right click, lock and hide selected, grab the antenna here. This one really shouldn't be moving around either. So we're going to grab the translate Y and Z, right click, lock and hide selected. And you want to be careful with finding the right balance between locking the things that will prevent the animator from making mistakes, while also not locking too many things such that the animator is going to wish that they had more control than you've given them. So I think we've hit that balance here. All of the arms can be rotated but not translated. The hip controls and clavicle controls can be translated as well as rotated. Now in this case, actually, I just want to move these up and down on these axes, so I am going to lock that these two additional channels. Right click, lock and hide selected. Let me do that for each of these. Okay, and then we should be able to translate X to pull that along there to collapse. Grab this one, translate X to collapse, and that's working quite well. Alright, and I did just a few more quick fixes off camera. I realized that my antenna was actually misspelled. I was missing an N in the name, but now that has been fixed. I had to fix it for every joint, every controller, the offset, and the script itself, so that's representative of the pain in the butt it can be if you're not checking those things ahead of time. So learn from my mistake. Double check your spelling before you get too far along in the process so you don't have to fix that kind of thing. I've also come in here and taken care of the heel flip joints because that was really going to bother me. Part of me wanted to just leave it and move on, but I couldn't let it go. So now with the heel joint actually moved up into place, my foot flips actually pivot without the feet falling out from underneath the ankle. So that's going to be much better for what this character needs to do. I also realized that early in the process I created this IKs group and actually never ended up putting anything in it. This is usually used for much more advanced rigs. If you got an IK spine or a handful of other particularly more advanced kinds of setups, you might need an extras folder, an IKs folder, a clusters folder, that kind of thing. And they would all be siblings of the joints and controls folders. But in this case, I didn't actually need the IKs group, so I'm just going to delete that. Okay, one more thing would be to actually come over to this controls layer, and we've got this P here. Now this is a relatively new feature in Maya. It's like visibility, but only for playback. So if I turn off the P and then I scrub on the timeline, we'll see that all of the controls actually disappear, which is awesome. And I'm going to turn off the joints right there. What's really great about that is that you can preview your animations without having to toggle off all the controls, and then when you're ready to keep animating, you don't have to come back to your layers and turn them back on again. It just automatically disappears, which is pretty cool. And the very last thing we need to do is to actually hook up our master control here so that it actually moves things. Now temporarily I had all of the controls be children of it, and that works for basic movement, but when we come in to do scaling, we end up with the character exploding away from the controls. So I'm going to now fix this and actually set it up the way it ought to be set up. I'm going to open up my controls group. I'm going to hide all the stuff inside of it right there, so we just have these three controls. And I'm going to grab each of those controls, then control click on the controls group and hit P. And that's going to unparent them from the control master and reparent them to the controls group. And that's because the master control is actually going to live outside of this, right under the main hierarchy of this character right here. So it'll be a sibling of these groups up here. And now we can actually set up the transform group and scale group to match the transforms of the master control. And we're just going to do that with the connection editor. So we'll go up to Windows, General Editors, Connection Editor, select the master control, reload left, select the global transform group, reload right, and it looks like because I've locked the key ability of these, it's complaining. So I could change my filtering, but instead I'm just going to unlock these for a moment, right click, make selected keyable, just for now, so that it'll show up in this list, and we should be able to reload left. There they are. And we'll just go from translate to translate, rotate to rotate, and then we actually want to load the other group here, global scale, and we'll reload right, go scale to scale. So now, if we go back to Control Master, we should be able to move it around, rotate it around, and scale it. Awesome. This is the one control that doesn't live inside the controls group, but it has to do that so that it can do its job correctly. Okay, and then I'm just going to right-click on these again and say Make Selected Non-Keyable, just to put that back the way it was. And we can still get all of this action here just fine. I'm going to collapse this guy right here as well, collapse this group, and we can have everything living inside of BilliardBot. And this is really important because if we were ever to import it into another Maya scene, the character would be all encapsulated in this particular folder right here, rather than spread out through a couple of objects that could be misplaced. So this is really excellent right here. All right, and with that, I think that we are done with this rig. We've got controls that visually represent what they do. We've got limits on them. Everything's named. We've got a range of motion that works for this character. We've got a good bind. We've got weight painting that works. Just about everything has really come together for this. Of course, there's lots of things we could add, but honestly, it's good enough for what this character is supposed to do in this game. So the next stage would be to export it, get those animations working, attach all the textures, and this is pretty much a finished asset. Thank you for watching. Hopefully you learned something. Feel free to leave questions and comments on any of these 3 videos, and I'll do my best to answer any of those. And other than that, good luck on your rigs.